There's a couple of things probably that you'd like to know about Volkan. One is that he showed up at SCI-Arc on our doorstep in April, like many young faculty do. And SCI-Arc is in an unusual position for that to happen. And he showed me some of his stuff, and I said, "You're hired." And the reason I did that is because the things that he showed me were at a kind of critical intersection of a whole range of ideas and propositions that architecture is interested in these days. He spent a couple of years working with Foster and Associates in London, so he was kind of into the discussion of technology in the late modern idiom. Then went on to work at Future Systems, where the idea of the object and the machine and the contemporary expression of that seems to somehow result in an architecture that's very active, that is engaging and simultaneously is responsive to the user. And finally spent a couple of years rounding off his abilities at the studios of Asymptote in New York, where he was really interested in probably the post-suprematist work that those architects are kind of primarily involved in. If you look at the work that his own personal portfolio includes, which is not so much work that he's done in offices, but work of his own hand, that's a kind of extraordinary set of Piranesian drawings that really occur once in a generation, I believe. There are people who draw because they need to document something, and there are people who aren't a drawing. They really think and are through their drawings. I think Volkan is one of those people, a very unusual person, a very unusual young architect. I think we're really fortunate to have him with us, and I'd like you to help me welcome him officially.
Well, thank you, Chris, for the kind words. It was also thank you to SCI-Arc, being and Eric, to give me the opportunity to be here. Also, of course, thank you to the audience for coming today. I would like to show you today a project which I refer to as the White Series. And it's a set of conceptual drawings investigating speculative architectural environments through the means of drawing. Illustrations that explore an individual tectonic language, described in reference to abstractions, composition of form, and use of complex systems. These drawings, in a way, are an ongoing process that I've been dealing with for the last few years. And some of them actually have been exhibited and published in magazines, or here on the right at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. But before I kind of explain the idea behind these drawings in more detail, I want to go back in time a little bit and show you some aspects of the design and history that both in a way inspired my work and influenced me as an architect and designer. What we see here is the black square by Malevich, and it's not simply a black square on a white background. It's actually much more than that. It kind of represents infinity of space, simplicity and complexity, all in one drawing. It's a suprematist painting that kind of liberated itself into a new area of space and time. Documenta 5, Hausrucker Co. These guys are some kind of pioneers, let's say, of speculative design, forming a contrast and in a way crossing borders that have not been crossed before. Basically architects, designers who are not afraid to question the existence, while still creating visionary spaces that are both critical and constructive in a way. Walking City by Archigram, obviously a very influential project, but I think it's also important to recognize this project as well on the social level of, let's say, territorialization or deterritorialization, some kind of global phenomena of entire cultures and ideas invading space, moving from one place to the other, and kind of the consequences that occur with this kind of transfer. Leave the Void by Yves Klein. It's I mean, Yves Klein is quite influential for many, many designers, but this is actually quite an interesting picture. It's a performance. But then you look at it and you think about, is it really a performance? What is it? It's basically, it's a photo montage from the 1960s, and I think it's somehow about the unexpected, the kind of speculation that happens in architecture. What will happen next? What's the next step? You know, it represents in a way the kind of impact that our ideas as designers, have on other people, and the kind of consequences that occur as well. This is an interesting project. It's a motorcycle design proposal by Luigi Colani. But for me, the interest in this project is not so much the form, which might have some certain elegance to it and a certain beauty for some people. But for me, it's rather the idea of merging, and in this case, merging the machine and the human and the certain specifications that come with it into kind of one object, the idea of hybrid structures, and also the optimization of design. This is a collection piece by Hussein Chalayan, and I think fashion design, for instance, is a very creative field. And Hussein Chalayan is a designer with the kind of concept to interconnect and collaborate with other entities and other fields. So in a way, cross-referencing and kind of merging techniques and technologies with other fields. And in a way also opening new markets, opening new scenarios for design. This is an interesting project, the Egg by André Brier. And for me, it shows the kind of contrast of typology. This is obviously a design in New York. We're all familiar with Manhattan. But the typology that kind of jumps into certain places and creates certain dependencies of components in an urban scale. Also the kind of the opposite, showing the opposite of something else. Some experiment to make something different within our level of experiences. The Donut House by Future Systems. I think this project is also about technique. How to draw something complex. And in this case also very interesting in my opinion, but without any use of the digital tool. This is a project completely drawn by hand with analog tools. It's constructed completely by hand, and if you look at the complexity of form, it's not really easy to generate an image like this. So not many people can do this anymore, and obviously Jan Kapitsky passed away this year, so it's quite a big loss. But then, of course, new interests occur during time, and such as the use of systems and compositions. In this case, installation called Aperiodic by the Very Many, led by Mark Fornes, who's a very young, talented man based in New York. And he looks at compositions of elements through mainly computation and digital prototyping, and using that as a kind of theme. Not necessarily in terms of form making, so he's not really interested in the form, but rather interested in variation and process as a tool. A project that I really like, the Hanging Cemetery of Baghdad by Naya de Ostos, which stands for Nanette Yorkovsky and Ricardo Ostos. Two good friends of mine based in London. They both teach at the AA, have published 2 books, and this is one of them. And it's about speculative environments, the use of narrative in a way to arrive at architecture. And in this case, reflecting towards the issue of war in Iraq, and in a way, a reference towards storytelling, such as, let's say, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that this refers to. But yeah, I mean, especially in my case, when you spend most of your time working and collaborating within the last few years with other designers, I think it's also important to kind of look back and see what lessons they have been learned and what new experiences you take with you for your upcoming challenges and designs. So I want to show you briefly some examples of projects that I was involved with within the last few years. And I'd kind of like to mention some of the characteristics that were important to me and also fundamental to the projects, but also maybe things that did not maybe turn out too good. So go back. This is the London City Hall by Foster and Partners. And somehow the idea that technology can drive the design of the building and how design reacts and informs certain qualities. But also how maybe the ambition can be stretched far, so that execution cannot follow. In this case, reworking most of the interior design that was not performing to its standard, and introducing kind of in situ solutions to solve those problems that occur. Zenit Music Hall for some partners. I was involved in this project mainly during the competition stage, and later on it got built almost one-to-one as we proposed it. And the concept was about sustainability. It somehow generates the form of the building and can also be a design driver for its performance. The shape and size of the roof, for instance, is designed with the only aspect that it's collecting prevailing wind from both directions. And the wind is used to kind of cool and ventilate the building. This is the Syria headquarters by Future Systems. And this project is somehow about the use of intelligence and intelligent concepts that kind of introduce basic components within buildings that are based only on pure performative aspects, such as the size of the floor plates, for instance, that allow natural ventilation because of the dimension. But if you look at all the components, they still form an elegant solution as a building. The Prague Library by Future Systems, a very, very controversial project. But for us, it was more about high-tech design and optimization of program and function, in this case, a library. And the transfer of technology as well, such as the proposed underground automatic storage and retrieval system, kind of bunker that holds all the books. But in a way, also the idea to create buildings with certain characteristics that look into the future. And some are also trying to be always be a few steps ahead of time. So in this case, we might have been a bit too far. This is the master plan project in Bergamo by Asymptote that just received planning permission. And if you're familiar with Italian projects, it takes a long time to receive them. So the office was very happy when this happened. And Asymptote is led by Hani Rashid and Design Couture, very talented people. And they're interested somehow in the composition of form maybe, or proportion. Sometimes also design that creates an overall sculpture, but still and then becomes its own corporate identity maybe. The kind of generator of change within an existing structure. The Seoul Yongsan master plan that at the end was won by Liebeskind. But this project was somehow about the creation of significant place. Seoul being a very large city and with a very influential identity, it's about stitching into the existing fabric of a cityscape on a larger level, and it's about complex urbanistic situations in a way to create an architecture and logical concept that is bold, but also flexible to exist and coexist in a way a globalization of architecture. an installation at the Venice Biennale, also by Asymptote. And sometimes you also are forced, or you have the pleasure actually, to work on design that's on a smaller, much smaller scale. In this case, an installation, which can be more challenging sometimes than working on, or most of the time, it's more challenging than working on a building itself. And in this project, the idea of effect and atmosphere and consciousness, these were topics that were of interest. To create vision, but somehow also leave a sense of imagination to the spectator with using these mirror effects and these ambitious forms. But in this project also the idea of collaboration with fabricators, digital, fabrication, which transfers ideas directly into the computer and then straight into the machine to fabricate. So when I arrived here a few weeks ago, I was invited by Peter Cook to sit on a jury, and it's great to have Peter around. And I'm glad that he manages to come to SCI-Arc quite frequently. I think it's very beneficial. But for me, it's been a while since I was in touch with him and saw him the last time. So for some funny reason, he introduced me to the other jury members as the guy in Bartlett that was into robots. So, in a way, very reminiscent for me, since that is not really what I'm into these days, but it is true, I was experimenting actually quite a lot with robots, and I'd also like to show you some of the projects that I was developing. There's of course the idea of the robot that conveys certain aesthetic and functional qualities within. But I was rather interested in the kind of mechanical movements of its parts, of the many parts, and how things come together and maybe work as a system. And it's also about the kind of potential of the machine and the constant change of its parts in terms of movement. The idea of the human and the machine again merging into a hybrid, or simply sharing some of the identities that they have. The movement and flux of objects changes, just something that just moves into multiple dimensions, and maybe multiple dimensions that happen at the same time. And of course expressing the idea through several means of media, which kind of offered me to generate a different view all the time and open new discussions on the topic of the robotic. But it's also about elements moving in space. It's kind of independency from gravity or any other forces that would, lead them to certain directions. Some kind of distortion and an alteration from its original shape. But I was also trying to focus on the parts that I actually needed for this kind of device and how they work together as a system, or as a matter of fact, as a form or as a solution. But it was also important to place these ideas into context and somehow testing them on any scale. For instance, this one just touching the street of, in this case as well, Los Angeles. And it's also about the kind of difference of shapes and forms and their specific functions. Again, testing ideas in compositions with this piece, which is actually a physical model layered with several drawings. But besides the entity of movement, I was also interested in the behavior of objects within a larger system, and the dependencies that they kind of create or sometimes not create systems that are either linear or non-linear, homogeneous or heterogeneous. So I was building, in a way, multiples and armies, clones and instances but also merged individuals, components, and tested different scenarios in a way, some kind of conglomeration of these robots. And I was looking into creating abstract stories sometimes, narratives that would just tell the story, or maybe something emerges or moves. I was creating scenarios like these where it's not really about the robot, but in a way, the atmosphere that is created through an image. I was, in a way, also speculating on potential environments and how larger entities can actually form a unit. And then, of course, extensions to the initial robot, maybe plugging into something else, and forming a composition of several elements that, at the end, maybe are a larger entity like a base, or sometimes even a city. So, after these studies of the robots, I actually had more questions, and there were more questions raised than answered. So, in a way, questions like, what are the drivers of design? What is the strategy? And what does a figure do for me? What does it do for the design? What is the function? Or what is the relationship within these different types of entities? And also the fundamental question on how to arrive at architecture, how to define space. Is it just a sketch on a paper? Is it just a digital model? Or can there be some certain system? Can you propose a system? So I had the idea to search for a method in a way that's coherent with my ideas, with my ideologies that I showed you earlier, but still offers parameters of performance, eloquence, and certainly quality of space. So I started a certain quest to look for these systems and strategies to create a design language. And of course, I had to look at precedents to see where this has maybe happened before, maybe not. In this case, it was including signs and symbol catalogs that share cohesive systems, sometimes simple systems, but sometimes very complex systems, and basically convey information. These are graphic signs, and I think we're all very familiar with most of them on a global level. And they're describing and representing somehow certain information, bits and pieces, and are represented by images or abstract graphics. But I think all of them can clearly be identified, so that these signs are very important for us to communicate as a form of communication. It almost acts as a set of rules that define that system and that communication. And they organize, in a way, our structure and the day we live on a daily basis. So if you start looking into these things, you find more interesting stuff. These are mechanical signs. Basic signs for technical devices, like how machines work. But also graphics that explain the use of buildings and the systems. Using simplification, let's say, of the existing items such as paper that's just stacked into a machine. And maybe in combination with directional symbols like an arrow, just pointing towards a direction. And they certainly explain movements and function. And it's also a simple sign language or manual on how to work things. And then you look further and you find these things like weather signs, describing weather conditions. It's a set of principles, again, where simple graphics are used or programmed to inform. I mean, mostly used by weather experts who are producing or collecting data, but it's, I think, interesting for us to see that it's represented through basic, simple geometry, such as dots, lines, arcs, etc. And if you look at it closer, it's kind of using methods of direction, such as the wind, and again, arrows, or additive symbols for speed, like 1 or 2 or 3, signs next to each other. There's also the so-called Braille language, sign language for blind people. It basically consists of a series of bumps or dots, and they are in a certain order so that if you're blind, you can feel and recognize them as distinct letters. And it's conveying information simply through its form and the kind of combination of components that they are. So it is a simple system to represent language, which, and if you look at language, it's actually quite a complex system. So there's a way to represent complex things with simple things. These are wall drawings, so this is one wall drawing by Malevich. It's basically a conceptual art piece from the 60s, and it's based on a set of rules which are defined by Levitt. You can find some of these drawings at the DIE Beacon in New York, if you ever go there or close to New York. And these drawings have mainly been executed by other people, not the artist himself. He just simply set up a set of rules so that everyone else would just follow those rules to create these kind of forms and shapes and these abstract elements. So, looking at those precedents, it seems like there are several systems that convey information and that also share coherent ideas. And as I mentioned earlier, my interest changed from designing an object, such as a robot or a building, to designing a strategy or system from where new objects or designs would emerge. But the question is, of course, on how to create a design process or design system with non-figurative and non-concrete elements, purely based on strategy, or basically how to create a system of architectural space through abstraction. And this is in a way where I started my investigation into the process of the White series, and I would like to read some chapters of a paper that I recently wrote to summarize the concept behind these drawings, the definition. The White series is a set of conceptual drawings investigating speculative architectural environments. The experimental work represents a progressive discourse and creates a dialogue towards the investigation of strategies to generate new space and design. The illustrations shown explore individual tectonic language described by several individual parameters. And the design of the occurring spaces is influenced and generated in reference to abstraction, composition of form, and use of complex systems. Within this process, architecture is generally perceived as a relationship of concepts, art and science. This idea includes creative components that are merged with the geometrical references to speculate and design architectural environments. In terms of philosophy, design is seen as a pattern, a purpose, or is described as a matter of complexity. Complexity, however, has always been a prominent topic within the field of architecture. It represents a structured, non-random organization. This organization consists of related basic components which create mutual dependencies and act as a system. Components are flexible members within the system and vary in any appearance, number, size, or function. These complex systems are highly dimensional within a spatial environment and based on non-Euclidean geometries, or in other words, non-parallel geometries. The idea and concept behind the White series is to create potential architectural environments through the evolution of abstract elements to form complex spatial systems. The term abstraction is a key entity to the work and needs to be investigated in its context and origin. Abstraction somehow is one of the central questions of metaphysics, which basically manifests the principles of reality and how we understand the world, our existence, space, time, and so on. Abstraction is also a process or result of generalization by reducing the information content of observable phenomena typically to retain only information which is relevant for a particular purpose, in this case to create space. In the 20th century, the trend towards abstraction coincided with advances in science, technology, and changes in urban life. Today, abstraction manifests itself in more purely formal terms and a reduction of form to basic geometry. Main element of the design process for the White series is to introduce a framework of geometry and aesthetic. While the aesthetic is defined through shape, contrast, and composition, the geometry is referring back to scale, space, and dependence. A mutual agreement between these themes is essential to understand the occurring relationships. The platform for each drawing manifests itself within the media of illustration. A white background on paper, which is then infiltrated by basic lines and geometric elements. The simple use of this media represents already a more complex configuration and refers back to similar ideologies in architectural history. The suprematism and constructivism movements by artists such as Elitsitsky, Malevich, and Rodchenko in Russia in the early 20th century established a language and use of elements on a white canvas, non-objective and non-related to anything except geometric shapes and colors. The white background was considered to be an infinite space with no dimension, which allowed artists to define the work, liberated from scale, gravity, and perspective, while purely generating clarity of form. Suprematism expressed forms in movement or through time, and because of the simplicity of these basic forms, the suprematists were able to signify a new beginning, a new era of art and form. Within the White series, the form is seen as an abstract element described only through contrast, shape, and composition. Contrast is usually determined through color and brightness of an object within a visible spectrum. To achieve a high contrast, it is important to use a color which distinguishes itself clearly from a white background. So even though black is not considered a color, and rather described as an achromatic color representing only the shade of an object that do not reflect light, it performs in this case as the optimal contrast for the purpose of this investigation. The shape itself appears as an outline of boldness. It does not imply mathematical configurations, size, symmetry, or orientation, but defines itself only through basic geometrical elements such as points, lines, curves, hyperbolic, elliptic, and planes. The combination of these shapes then form a non-Euclidean composition. The composition itself is depending on proportion and harmony of the components. Configurations within these compositions can influence the general point of focus and determine the visual dimension and depth of perspective, space, and time, the assemblage. Gilles Deleuze defines assemblage as a dynamic interconnection of congruent singularities that remove the subject-object interface, but yet retain specific elements. Human assemblage, for example, is a multiple that forms a new assemblage with existing social and cultural networks of material movement, force, and intensity. Manuel de Landa, in his book, The New Philosophy of Society, Assemblage Theory and Social Complexity, employs Deleuze's theory of assemblages to assume social entities on all scales and to define a new ontology, which is a theory for the nature of being, that challenges the existing paradigm of social analysis. The entities range from the individual, micro, over national to intercontinental, macro, and imply that they are best analyzed through their components or the networks they form. De Landa states that assemblages are not seamless totalities, but collections of heterogeneous components, which are basically objects or systems consisting of multiple items with a large number of structural variations, and that they should be analyzed as such. Its components are defined by relations of exteriority, or in other words, their role within the larger system or assemblage is not what defines them. So this implies already that a component has essential characteristics and may be unplugged from one assemblage and plugged into another space without losing its identity. The design process within the White series is not a set of social assemblages, but it's a set of spatial assemblages, or architectural assemblages, which is defined as a network of individual elements to form a unit or structure, and to enable the perception of space. In a way, space can be defined in many ways, including the view that it's part of a fundamental abstract mathematical structure within which we compare and quantify the distance between objects, their sizes, shapes, and their speed. The most common definition of space, though, is typically noted as a three-dimensional, and that each dimension is described through numbers specifying objects and their location compared to other locations. The perception of space through this particular design process manifests itself in an abstract architecture dimension. The parameter for this new architecture environment within the White series is not set in scale and can vary in size and area ranging from micro to mega dimensions. It refers to existing spatial compositions to explore the notion of dimension, dependence, and scale. A way to define dimension or spatial dependence for this environment could be the first law of geography by Bartlett, which states that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. Thank you very much.